Hi, it's Dwyer, gamblersadvisory.com. Happy Easter, everyone. Um, this is the day after Bernard Hopkins' victory over Roy Jones. And at the end of that fight, the executioner called out David Haye. He said he wanted to fight for the heavyweight championship of the world against heavyweight champion David Haye. Let's hope that fight happens because I believe that fight would be a bonanza for gamblers, regardless of who you're taking, because I believe that that fight is an easy straddle. Now, before I begin, let me just say, last night, take a look at what the Las Vegas casinos and what your bookmaker in the UK posted the fight at. You're going to see that Bernard Hopkins, by American odds, was a greater than minus 500 favorite, and that the odds on Hopkins to win the fight by KO were even money. Now, my point to you is simply that you would get similar odds in David Haye's favor if Hopkins, who has never fought at heavyweight, were to take on a heavyweight champion who hasn't lost in several years and who has a very high knockout ratio and is coming off of a great stoppage against a very hard to stop John Ruiz. Now let's be conservative and let's talk about what I mean by a straddle, okay? What I mean is that you're betting on both sides of the bet and you are eliminating outcomes. Now, if you're a David Haye fan, if you believe David Haye wins this fight, chances are you have an idea on how he would do it, and that idea involves David Haye being too big, having too big a punch, being too fast, landing a right hand or a left hook on Bernard Hopkins, dropping Hopkins, and winning the fight by KO. Right? That's the most likely outcome if you're taking David Haye. Because other than his fight against Valuev, David Haye usually doesn't like to go the distance in fights. He usually ends it by knockout like he did yesterday against John Ruiz, where either he stops the guy or the guy quits on his stool, right? If you're a Bernard Hopkins believer, then you're wondering how David Haye, who doesn't like to fight inside, will handle Bernard Hopkins coming inside on him, blocking that right hand, throwing off his tempo, and getting inside of Haye's range, making the fight uncomfortable for Haye, and knowing all the tricks to stay alive. I mean, understand, Bernard Hopkins has never been knocked out his entire career, right? You also realize, if you're a Bernard Hopkins believer, that Bernard Hopkins is 6'1". David Haye is 6'3". The height differential isn't that great. Not only that, but unlike Lennox Lewis and George Foreman, David Haye doesn't really throw his weight around at heavyweight. He doesn't spend a lot of time leaning on you and making sure you're aware that you're the smaller guy. He doesn't do that. He's a guy who fights outside, kind of like Vladimir Klitschko, fights outside, and so the weight issue really isn't a real issue because Haye wouldn't be leaning on Bernard Hopkins, trying to tire Bernard Hopkins out. Not only that, if you think about it, Bernard Hopkins probably has the vastly superior stamina to David Haye, right? And in terms of chance, let's remember, David Haye got dropped outside of the heavyweight division. He's been down in fights against fighters who really weren't known to have big time punches. And of course, in the heavyweight division, he was knocked down by Monty Barrett. And so, um, in terms of chins, Bernard Chin measures up pretty well. But keep in mind, you don't even have to do detailed analysis because Bernard Hopkins is likely to be a plus 400 to plus 500 underdog. And it's an easy straddle to straddle that against David Haye by KO, where I believe you'll probably get better than even money odds since Bernard has never been knocked out. All you need to do to prevail in a straddle is to make sure you're getting better than even money on both sides of the bet. If either part of the bet happens, you make money. So let me give you an example. Let's say I had $200 or 200 pounds. If I put 100 on Bernard Hopkins to win at 4 to 1, and I'm being conservative because we know since last night's fight, Bernard was favored at a minus 500. You'd probably get better odds than 4 to 1 on Bernard Hopkins. Let's say I put $100 on Bernard Hopkins at 4 to 1, and I put $100 on David Haye by KO, because I think we all know David Haye is not going to get a decision against Bernard Hopkins. If he wins the fight, it's probably going to be by KO. Now, let's say David Haye by KO is a plus 110, right? If it's a plus 110 using American odds, then if David Haye wins the fight by KO, I actually get 5% return on my investment. Not great, but keep in mind, I'm making money on my hedge, right? Because I would get $110 back for the 100 I bet on David Haye while losing the 100 I bet on Bernard Hopkins. So I would net $10 on the $200 bet. That's a great hedge when you consider the fact that if Bernard Hopkins pulls the upset, Bernard Hopkins would literally triple your money, because you would get at 4 to 1 odds $400 back. Then you would subtract out the $100 that you bet on David Haye. So let's hope this fight happens, because I believe this fight only has one of two outcomes. On the Bernard Hopkins side of the aisle, you don't even have to figure out how Bernard would win, right? Even though I'm telling you, I believe there's a chance Bernard might even win this by knockout. But you don't even have to take that risk. You could literally just take Bernard to win the fight and triple your money if it happens. Whereas on the David Haye side, if David Haye does win by knockout, then you actually still make a profit while you had exposure to possible far greater upside. Let's even go further, right? For harder core gamblers, let's say that David Haye by knockout is even money, right? Even that's a spectacular bet, because while you wouldn't make money on David Haye by knockout if you straddle, right? You wouldn't lose money if David Haye wins by knockout, and you would have exposure. You would have a chance at the huge payoff that you would get if Bernard Hopkins were to win this fight by decision. Let me just briefly talk about the fight. David Haye is the haymaker. He is a legitimate heavyweight champion. Here's the problem: he can't fight inside. When Bernard Hopkins gets inside on him, what exactly is David Haye going to do? Can anyone here tell me? I believe it's up in the air. Anytime you don't know what a favorite's going to do and put in a situation that you know he's going to be put in, then that tells me that that favorite is a shaky bet. I agree that Bernard looked terrible against Roy Jones, doesn't match David Haye's hand speed, doesn't match David Haye's size, doesn't match David Haye's power. But of course, this isn't a decathlon. This is actually the sweet science. And of the two of them, it's clear that Bernard Hopkins is the seasoned fighter. Bernard Hopkins is the technician. And quite frankly, Bernard Hopkins can get inside on anybody. You saw him get inside last night on Roy Jones, who is, in my opinion, as fast as David Haye even today, right? Jones might not have the legs or the reflexes anymore. He certainly has the hand speed. And you saw Bernard get inside on David Haye. Styles make fights. Also, David Haye hit John Ruiz repeatedly yesterday with the nice overhand right. Here's the problem. You know his Sunday punch is that overhand right. Do you really think Bernard Hopkins is going to stand there and allow David Haye to land an overhand right on him? I would invite you to take a look at John Ruiz's fight against Roy Jones. Look at the right hands Roy Jones landed against him, and count the right hands Roy Jones didn't land last night against Bernard Hopkins.